Hi everyone, today we're going to do some N-gon modeling in Blender and we're going to create this highly detailed, realistic looking object that is based on a CAD model I found on Grabcad. N-gon modeling in many cases is easier than polygon modeling, but like polygon modeling, it has its own set of rules and challenges. When we create this object, we need to make sure that the shading is working and that the bevels are working. So these are the most important things when you do an N-gon model like this. We're not too concerned with topology, but even though N-gon modeling can be easier to create complex looking shapes like this, it's not like you can get away with anything. Even though we're not going to pay too much attention to the topology, we still have to look out for certain things, and I will create a reasonably clean mesh that makes sense. This is going to be a long tutorial and it's going to be step by step, but I wouldn't recommend it for complete beginners. You do need a basic knowledge of Blender, and that will make it much more fun to follow along. In the video I will also be using a number of add-ons. Some of them ship with Blender, some of them are free, and I'm going to use 2 commercial add-ons which are not required to complete the tutorial, but they will make certain things a lot easier and faster. Here you can see the model that we'll be doing. This is the reference object. I found this on Grabcad. Grabcad is a site that provides free models, and it's a great site for downloading references. However, everything on Grabcad is provided in some kind of CAD format, so if you want to use those objects, you will need software like Moment of Inspiration that can import those CAD formats, and then you can use that CAD software to export the object as an OBJ or FBX, for example. And that is basically what I did. I took this object, opened it with Moment of Inspiration, created an OBJ, and if you want to, you can download this OBJ and use it as a reference too. It is not required to follow along and complete the tutorial, but it's probably going to be helpful. You will find a link in the video description. Let's talk about the add-ons that I will be using. Some of them, like I mentioned, are shipped with Blender. If you go to Edit Preferences and go to the Add-ons tab, the ones we'll be needing here is the Bool tools, the Loop tools, and that's the second one here, Mesh Loop tools. And if you look for Pi, you will find an option that says Interface 3D Viewport Pi menus. And here you can activate a number of additional Pi menus. I'm only using 2 of them, and actually in this video I'm only going to use the hotkey Z Pi menu. I don't think you need to activate this one in order to be able to follow along, but I'm mentioning it just in case you're wondering why my Z menu is, or my Z Pi menu is looking slightly differently than yours. As for the free add-ons, I will be using Machine Tools. I have the commercial version, but you don't need that. The free version will be sufficient. And I'm also going to use the free version of Bagger Pi. As for the commercial add-ons, I'll be using Mesh Machine. The commercial add-ons, I'm not sure if I mentioned that before, they are not required to complete the tutorial, but they will make a lot of things easier. Mesh Machine, for example, can be used to symmetrize geometry in edit mode, which is super helpful and super fast. You can do the same thing in Blender by going to, let me just try to show you that. If you go to Mesh, you have a symmetrize function here, but compared to Mesh Machine, it's quite clunky and it's a lot slower. We will need to symmetrize geometry all the time, so for me, Mesh Machine is the weapon of choice because it makes things much more comfortable and much faster. The other add-on that I'll be using is called QOL, Select Contiguous Edges. This is really helpful for selecting loops that you cannot select with the Blender tools. You have a similar option in Mesh Machine that might also work for this kind of task. I will put links to Grabcad and all of the add-ons that I'm using, the free ones and the commercial ones, in the video description. I have also divided this video into chapters. You can jump to those chapters by using the timestamps in the video description or just using the links just at the bottom of the video itself. And with that said, let's go ahead and have some fun and model this object in Blender using Booleans and N-gons. I have already imported the object that I will be using as a reference here. If you go to the Item tab, you can see the dimensions here. Let's go to the scene properties and change the units to centimeters. You can see this is 20 by 7 by 20. We're not going to model anything according to specific dimensions except for the basic shape, so we'll make it the same size. Because the basic outline of this object is cubic, we can start with a cube, and I'll make this 20 by 7 by 20. And we need to scale this down a bit on the y-axis because those 7 centimeters include the details on the front and on the back. So I'm going to scale this down to about here. That looks good. And what I'll also do is I'll change some settings here in the viewport. By default, I have set up Blender so that I can see the wireframe view in object mode as well. But in this particular case, it's probably a good idea to switch that off in the overlays. As you can see here, I have switched on face orientation, and this will be helpful in spotting any faces that are facing the wrong direction. I do want to see the wireframe on my model though, so I'll go to the object properties here, scroll down to the viewport display, and turn on wireframe for the cube here. Let's apply scale and rotation, and I'll switch to the front view. Let's tab into edit mode. I'm going to add a loop cut right here at the center, and then I'm going to select the vertices at the top here and move those down a bit. And I'll select these ones and move them up a bit, and then switch to edge mode, and let's do a bevel. And I'm going to bevel all the way to the corners and use maybe 20 segments. I want this to be nice and smooth. Because I've beveled this all the way to the corners, we have overlapping geometry here, so let's select all the vertices, hit M and do a merge by distance here. For now, I'm going to move the reference object over a little bit. And there's one more thing I want to do. Let's select this object. I'm going to add a bevel modifier right away. This will also help me to spot any mistakes in the mesh. And let's go ahead and set this up. I'll give it 3 segments, and in the geometry section I'm going to switch the mitering to arc, and this will just give us nicer geometry in the corners. I'm also going to switch off loop slide and clamp overlap. And you can see everything turns into a mess. That's because the bevel amount is way too high. I'm going to change that to something like 0.05. And down here in the shading section, let's switch on harden normals, and this should fix any shading issues. Okay, because we're going to do N-gon modeling in this video, we don't need all of this geometry, so I'll clean up everything as much as I can, especially in this case because all of these edges will get in the way of the other details that we're going to create. Let's go into edit mode, and I'm going to select all the faces on the front and hit F twice to turn these into N-gons, and I'll do the same thing here at the back. The first cutout that I'll make is that simple one here at the bottom, and we can use a cube for that. Let's select the object, Shift S, and I'll move the cursor to the selected object. And then I'm going to create a cube and scale it down. And I'll move it down, scale it up a bit to about the width of that cutout. Okay, so something like this should be fine. I'm going to auto smooth it, and I'll also do this for our model here. And I'm going to apply rotation and scale. Now sometimes what happens is that when you do that, the normals are reversed. We can fix that by going into edit mode, selecting everything, and then we can go to mesh normals and recalculate outside, and that will fix that issue. And that's why I switched on face orientation, so I can immediately see when that happens and fix the issue right away. Let's go ahead and move this over to 0 on the x-axis. And we're basically ready to do our first Boolean operation. Now there's 2 things I want to do. One is I want to right click on transform and pin it. And I also want to do that for the Bool tools. You can find the Bool tools on the tool tab. They're somewhere down here. We're going to use these all the time, so I'm going to pin them and move them to the top of the list. And once I've done that, and let's move the transform right below the Bool tool menu here. And now if I switch to any of the other tabs, these two menus will always be visible and they'll always be at the top and easy to find. If you unfold the Bool tool menu, you can see we have two sections here. One is auto Boolean and one is brush Boolean. Auto Boolean is for destructive Boolean operations, so the cutters will be applied immediately, and brush Boolean is non-destructive, which means that we will create modifiers. The way I work with N-gon modeling most of the time in Blender is that I start with brush Boolean operations, and doing it like that will enable me to make any changes to the cutter that I want to make, and once I'm happy I can apply that cutter and then make any changes to the mesh or fix the mesh if I have to, and then I can move on to the next Boolean operation and to creating the next details. There is no need for us to stay non-destructive, especially on an object like this. I already know what details need to go in there, and as soon as I'm happy with everything, I'll just go destructive and clean up the mesh and then move from detail to detail basically. So that's how I work with N-gon modeling most of the time. Let's select both of these objects and do our first brush Boolean difference operation here. You can see the shading changes and the bevels are not working, and this is a very common problem and it's easy to fix. If you go to the modifier properties, you can see that the reason why this is happening is because the Boolean modifier is below the bevel modifier, and if we move that to the top, you can see everything's working as expected. The shading looks fine and the bevels are working too. Let's go ahead and apply the cutter and we can delete this object. Next I'm going to do the cutout between the front and the back wall. We have a bit of thickness here. What we also need to take into consideration is this part in between the front and the back. And this I will do right away because it will be easier than adding a Boolean union later. And there's one thing I'll do differently, and that is I'm going to create an additional inset in this area here because I think it will look nice. In order to create the cutout, we can use the geometry that we already have. I'm going to select the face here at the front, hit Shift and D to duplicate it, right click to keep it in its position, and then hit the P key and split the selection off. Let's select our new object here and move it forward a bit, and here I'm going to move these two vertices down a bit, and this will be my inset. In order to create this part here at the center, what we can do is select the edges on the sides, right click and subdivide them. And then I'm going to bevel this edge here. We don't need any segments, and let's make it about yay high. And I'll just move my reference object over here to adjust this a little bit. So I'll move this up a little bit. Again, no need to be super exact. Something like this looks fine. I just move this back to the center with Alt G and then move it back over to here. We can delete this face here. And because the edges on the cutter are flush with the edges on our model here, it's probably a good idea if we select them and extrude them and then scale them on the x-axis a little bit, like so. We also need to create the thickness for the wall, and we can do that by moving the vertices at the top down a little bit. And I'll do something like this, looks good. We also need to move these ones up a little bit, like so. I also want to move the origin to the faces, and we can do this with Shift S, and let's move the origin to the geometry. And now we can move this object over to 0 on the y-axis, which will place it exactly at the center of our model here. Let me just see, I want to move this up to here. Oh, looks like I can't do that. Okay, never mind. So we've moved the object to the center here. Let's tab into face mode. I'm going to select everything and extrude it back. We don't need the bevel modifier on this. And you can see we have reversed normals. We're going to fix those in a second. Let's move these faces over a little bit. And I'll try to make this about the same distance that we have at the top. In fact, I think I'm going to just select the vertices at the top and move them down a little bit further. Let's do something like this. Okay, and I think that looks good. Let's select everything and use Shift-N to recalculate the outside. I'm also going to isolate the selection for now because I want to get rid of the faces here at the center. I'm going to delete those and those, and we can clean the cutter up a little bit more and turn some areas into N-gons, like this one here. So hit the F key twice to turn these into N-gons, same down here. And we can select these edges, hit X and use dissolve edges, or you could just hit Control X to get rid of those. And we can also dissolve the edges down here. Okay, so that looks good. Let's go ahead and mirror this over. I'm going to use Mesh Machine to do that, and then I can loop select the edges here, Control X to dissolve them. Let's go back to object mode and hide everything. Select our model here, and let's do another brush Boolean difference. Let's move the cutter above the bevel. And that's looking good. Everything's nice and clean because we cleaned up the cutter. We're not getting any unnecessary edges here that we need to clean up on our model. And in my case, Blender has also created nice connections. Whenever you do a Boolean operation, like a Boolean difference, Blender needs two edges that connect to the rest of the geometry. Now, depending on how you do this, or depending on how Blender does it, basically it's fairly random. You may not get clean connections, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. In my case, everything looks good. The shading is okay, the bevels look fine. So let's go ahead and apply that cutter. I'm going to delete this object here and tab into Edit mode. Let me just demonstrate what I mean by those connections. So it could happen, for example, that Blender, instead of creating an edge here, it creates an edge like this between these two vertices. I'll just hit the J key to create an edge here and dissolve this one. Now, when that happens, you can see that the bevel is not working if we go back to object mode. So if that happens to you, you just need to create a different connection in an area that makes sense, like here in the corner. So with these two vertices selected, I'm going to hit the J key and I'm going to dissolve this edge here. And now everything looks fine. Next, I'm going to create those big holes at the center. Let's select this object, Shift S, and move the cursor to the selected object, and then I'm going to create a cylinder. I'll give it 64 segments. Make sure to use even numbers, and I'll make this quite detailed. If I want to, I can always go back to a lower poly version. Because I'm using even segments, I can easily reduce the geometry by half later. It is actually easier to create a higher poly version first and then turn it into a low poly version. The other way around is much more difficult and sometimes impossible. Let's auto smooth this and scale it down. And rotate it 90 degrees around the x-axis. I'm going to scale this down a little bit more. So we have a smaller hole at the back and a bigger hole at the front. I'm going to scale this up a little bit to something like this. It looks like the hole on the reference object for some reason is not perfectly circular. We don't need to worry about that. This part here needs to cut through the back wall. Let's tab into Edit mode. I'll select the face at the front, extrude it, and scale it up. And we need to scale it up to about where this cutout ends. So I need to make this a little bit bigger, something like that. And I'll extrude this forward, then go to Object mode, Control A, apply rotation and scale. And let's go ahead and move this over to 0 on the x-axis. And I'll just check this in the front view. We have about the same distance from the bottom edge to the edge of that circle than we do up here, so that's good. Let's go ahead and select both objects, do another Boolean difference here, move the cutter. Now the bevels look good. We have an issue with this part here, but that will be easy to fix once we applied the cutter. Also, I don't like the connections I'm getting, and in order to change those connections, I'll tab into edit mode. And I'll use Mesh Machine Symmetry option to mirror this over to the other side, and this will create edges at the center, and the Boolean operation will use those as the connections, and you can see everything looks a lot cleaner. Let's apply the cutter. Let's delete this object and tab into edit mode here. Next, we're going to fix this area here, and I think we should be able to just select these faces here and use manifold extrude. You can find that over here on the T panel. I have shortcut for all of the main extrude tools, so I'm going to use my shortcut for manifold, move this back and snap to here by holding down the control key. And by the way, I can do that because I have set up snapping so that it always includes vertices, edges, and edge center. That's my snapping default. Down here, I have set this to active instead of closest. This manifold extrude will create overlapping geometry, and we need to select all the vertices and do a merge by distance here to fix that. There's a few more changes I want to make. If you take a look at the bevels, everything's working fine, but we don't need all of that geometry, and it's up to you how you want to change that. You can either dissolve these edges and keep the edges in between, or for example, we could dissolve these edges and weld the vertices here, for example, and that's what I'll do in this case. As far as selections are concerned, I'm using a paid add-on called Power Select, and what this does for me, and Blender doesn't do that, is the first vertex in this case that I select will automatically be the active vertex, so no need for me to shift left click twice to turn a vertex into an active vertex. The first one will always be the active vertex. And with these two verts selected, I can do a merge at last, and for this I have a machine tools shortcut, so I can do this a little faster. I'll do the same thing down here. And then I'll just dissolve the edges in between, like so. Now over here, I'm going to select these two verts, hit J to create edges in between, and again use Mesh Machine. It also has an align function that is really useful in order to line these vertices up. Over here, I'll select these two verts, hit J to create a connection here, and I'll also create an edge here. And there's one more thing I want to change. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. I'm going to delete these faces here, and then select this edge, move it up, hold down Control, snap it to this one, and move this edge down a bit and snap it to this one. And we need to clean up the geometry over here. I'll do that by welding the vertices like so. And then I can select this edge here, hit F to close the gap, and same down here. Let's have a look at our reference model before we add the extrusions and that hole here. Here I'm going to make a couple of compromises. The geometry, as you see it here on the reference model, is really easy to create. However, it will not really work with the bevel modifier. And also, I don't really like this curve at the top of this part here. However, if you want to do it exactly like it is on the reference image, my recommendation would be not to use a bevel modifier, but instead use a material with a bevel node in order to fake the bevels. So I'm not going to do this curve up here. I do want the rounded corners on this inset here, but again, I will not make them flush with the back wall because that will not work with a bevel modifier. And also, we need to pay attention to the distance between this edge here and this one here. It needs to be big enough for the bevel modifier to work. And that hole here at the center is going to be simple enough, so no issues I'm expecting with regard to that. Let's go ahead and select this face here. I'm going to do another manifold extrude and move this edge back a bit, or this face back a bit rather. If you go to object mode, you can see the bevels are still working. I could even move this forward a little bit further if I wanted to. Just make sure you don't overlap the bevels here. That looks fine, so let's do a loop cut. We need 2 cuts here. And I'm going to scale these edges down on the y-axis a bit. Let's do something like this, and then I'm going to select these faces here and inset them. And I'm going to extrude these faces back a bit. And let's add the bevels to the corners. I'm going to ring select these edges here and these ones. So basically that's the 8 edges that you see highlighted here. And let's do a bevel on those. I'll do something like this and give it 6 segments. And if I tab back into object mode, you can see again we're having issues with the bevel. So let's fix the geometry. I'll start by welding some vertices in the corners here. And maybe, at least for now, I'll also create a connection here and here. This might make it a little bit easier to add that hole later. And we can select all of these faces here now, hit F twice to turn them into N-gons. Same down here. And you can see that fixes the bevel issue. We don't seem to have any problems in the corner, but I'm still going to select these faces here and turn everything into N-gons here. We don't need the edges over here either. I'll select them and dissolve them. Same here at the front. And let's loop select these edges here and dissolve them as well. The next detail that we're going to add is this small hole. And for now, I'm going to switch wireframe back on. Select this object, isolate it. And let's create another cylinder here. I'll give this maybe 16 segments. It's going to be a very small hole. Let's auto smooth this and scale it down. Rotate it 90 degrees along the y-axis. I'll move it over to here. Scale it down a bit more. So this needs to be about this big. Let's unhide everything. I'll move this over and I'll make sure that it is centered. So I'm moving it along the y-axis and snapping it to the center of this edge, and I'll move it along the z-axis and snap it to the center of this edge here. We also need to scale this up a little bit on the x-axis. Apply rotation and scale, and once again Blender reverses the normals for some reason. Just going to select everything, Shift N to recalculate the outside. And maybe we would get a cleaner connection if we create an edge in between here. So subdivide these 2 edges, and let's do another brush Boolean difference here. Let's move the cutter. And we do have a bit of an issue here where I created this edge. I think that's because of overlapping geometry. We can fix that once we applied the cutter. So let's go ahead and apply it, delete this one, and tab into edit mode here. Select all the vertices to emerge by distance, and everything's looking fine. And this detail is now finished. I can mirror this over to the other side. And next we're going to continue with the cutouts here at the bottom. Let's have a look at this detail first. Down here you can see we have a chamfer, and I think I'm going to do that on the top as well. Let's create the basic shape for the cutout first. We can add a cube here, and I'll move it down a bit, scale it down. And let's go to the bottom view here. I'll switch off the wireframe. Scale that cube a little more. And we need to fit this in between the two chamfered edges here. So I need to scale this down a little bit more. And I'm also going to scale it on the y-axis like so. And on the z-axis. And let's go ahead and apply rotation and scale. And then what I'm going to do is move it over to here and line it up with this gray area here. And then I'm going to use the free version of BaggerPy to create an array. And we're going to do a line array with 8 copies, and let's change the relative offset on the x-axis. I'm holding down Shift while I'm doing this. And there we go. Next, I'm going to the BaggerPy tab here. And we need to apply the array modifier on the BaggerPy tab and not in the modifier properties. So I'll hit the check mark here, Shift S, and move the origin to the geometry, Alt G to move the entire object to the center of the grid. And I'm going to move it down like so. And I think I want these individual pieces to be a little less wide along the x-axis. So I'll tab into edit mode, make sure that everything is selected. And up here I'm going to switch to individual origins, and then we can scale these pieces down a little bit on the x-axis. Let's do something like this maybe. And I'll switch that back to bounding box. Let's go ahead and do a brush Boolean difference here. Move the cutter on top of the bevel. And as you can see, the bevels are looking nice, and we're also getting connections in the right areas here. And this is important in this case because in order to be able to create chamfers along these edges, we do need connections in between the cutouts here. So that's looking good. I'm going to apply the cutter and delete this object here, and let's tab into edit mode. And let's see what changes we need to make. We definitely need connections in the corners here, so I'll do this with the J key. And I'm also going to change the connection here at the center and dissolve these edges here. I'm not going to worry about the other side because we're going to mirror this over right to left. And we need to do the same thing over here. Let's create a connection here and here. And again, I'm going to dissolve these edges here. And then we also need to do the same thing at the bottom. Okay, and that's looking good. Let me just do a final check. So we seem to have all the connections that we need. And now what I'm going to do is I'll make ring selections here. So let's select all of these edges here, and we also need these two edges, and we need to deselect the ones here at the center. Let's bevel these edges, and we only need one segment. I'll do maybe something like this. And the bevel looks okay. Maybe I'll reduce that a little bit more to maybe 0.04. And let's clean up the geometry a little bit. Now over here in the corners we need to move some vertices. So I'll grab this one, move it over, snap it to here. And let's move this one over, snap it to here. And we need to do the same thing on the other side. We don't need all of the extra geometry that we have right now after chamfering the edges, so I'll try to get rid of all of the polygons that I don't need here. And I think what I'm going to try is I'll select these two faces here, and then let's go to select similar, and I'll try polygon sides, and this seems to select everything that I want. We don't need to worry about these faces here, and we don't need to deselect them. And that is looking good. So let's hit the F key twice. And that's cleaning up the geometry quite a bit. Let's go to vertex mode. You can see we still have a lot of vertices that we don't need. In order to get rid of those, I'm going to select everything and then go to mesh, clean up, and let's do a limited dissolve. Now we need to be a little bit careful because the default maximum angle is a little bit too high. You can see we're losing a lot of the edges here at the top, for example, which I don't want. So what I'm going to do is I'll reduce the maximum angle to 0, and then holding down the Shift key, I'm going to left click and drag just a little bit until the vertices here at the bottom disappear. So everything else is not affected, only the vertices down here, and that's looking good. So let's mirror this over to the other side. And that's looking good. So that's the next detail finished. Let's continue with this detail here. Now, in order to create this detail here, I will first select this object here, and I'm going to select this face, Shift D to duplicate it, right click to keep it in the same position, and then use the P key and split this off as a selection. And let's select it and move it down a bit. Shift S, and let's move the cursor to selected. Well, actually, what I need to do first is Shift S and move the origin to the geometry. And actually I need the cursor over here, so I'm going to move that back to here. What I also need to do, if you take a look over here at the reference object, we need a bit of an edge here. So what I'm going to do is select this face and do an insert, and let's maybe do something like this. Looks okay. Control I to invert the selection, and X, and then let's delete the faces. Next, in object mode, I'm going to create a cylinder, and I'll give it maybe 32 vertices, that's fine. Let's scale it down and move it down a bit. And I'm going to move it over to here. Let me just switch on wireframe again. Let's scale this down a bit more and line it up with the reference. I'm going to scale this back up again, and let's auto smooth it. I'm also going to duplicate it, and I'm going to hide the copy for now. So that is the size that we need. Let's tab into edit mode, and I'm going to select the two faces at the top here. Let me just check that. I think it's these two faces here, and I'm going to extrude them and just move them up a bit like so. And then we need to do the same thing over here. So let's grab these two faces. Let me just check again. I think I need these two instead. Let's extrude them and move them over on the x-axis. And then I'm just going to mirror this to the bottom and to the left like so. And you can see here that this detail is not centered in this area, but it's offset to the left a little bit. And we need to take that into consideration a little bit later. But for now, we're going to move this object to the center of our face here. So I'm going to select this, Shift S, move the cursor to selected, then select this object here, Shift S, and move it to the cursor. And I'll do the same with our second cylinder. This will be our cutout for this hole here at the bottom. Let's hide this again, and what I'll do with this is, let me see, I'll just tab into edit mode. Just as a precaution, I'm going to select everything, do a merge by distance, and let me apply rotation and scale again, and I'm going to select both of these objects and do a Boolean difference. And we can get rid of the bevel modifier here, and let's apply our cutter. And I'm going to select these two objects and isolate them. So let's see, if you take a look at the reference object, you can see that we have rounded corners everywhere basically. And what I'll do first of all is I'll tab into vertex mode and let's go ahead and add bevels to here. And the reason why I'm keeping this centered for now is so I only need to make changes to this area here, and we can still mirror everything over to the right and to the bottom. So Control Shift B, let's do a bevel, and I'll do maybe 6 segments. And I'm going to do maybe something like this. Right now we have a lot of detail in the corners, but not a lot of detail on the bigger curve here. And I'll try to change that by selecting these edges here, and I'll subdivide them. We have a smoothness option here in the subdivide settings, but unfortunately in this case they won't do anything. So what we need to do next is make sure that we get a nice round curve, and in order to do that I'm going to add another cylinder here, and I'll give it a ton of segments, maybe not that many. And I'll scale this down. And let's get a little closer, and holding down Shift I'm going to scale this up to maybe about here. That looks good. And what I'll do now is I'll select each of these vertices and I'm going to snap them to the edges of our reference cylinder here. So let's start with this one. What we also need to do is change the transform orientation to normal. And now we can move each of these vertices along the x-axis, and holding down Control I can snap it to the edge of the reference cylinder here. So I'll do these for all of the vertices here. Okay, so that's looking good. Let's switch that back to global, and I'll just mirror this over. Let's go back to object mode. I'm going to hide this cylinder here, and that is looking pretty good, I think. So at least the curvature is looking nice and smooth, and we don't see any difference really between the small corners and this big curve here. So that's looking good. Let's go ahead and select all of these vertices, but before I do that actually I want to, let's see, that was our reference object for aligning the vertices. I'm going to unhide that second cylinder, which we're going to use to create the cutout here at the center. And I'm going to select both objects and tab into vertex mode and go to transparent view here, and I'll grab all of these verts here and just move them over. Maybe let's do something like this. We also need to add bevels to the other corners here, so let's go ahead and do that next. I'll start with this one down here. So let's add a bevel here, and I'll stick with 6 segments. I'll move it to about here, I think, and maybe I'll select these vertices and just use the loop tools and space these apart evenly. And we can mirror this down like so, and that's looking good. So let's go ahead and add some more bevels. I'll do these corners first. Control Shift B. Again using 6 segments, and let's do something like this maybe. And then I'm going to chamfer these two and make this a little bit bigger, maybe something like that. And let's mirror this down, and we're done. I'm going to unhide everything again. Let's go ahead and move these 2 objects up, and I'll select this one, move it up a bit further. And let's extrude the faces here. I'm going to select everything and extrude this up. Select all the faces, do a Shift N to reverse the normals. and I'm going to move this inside to, let's see, to maybe about here. Something like that should be fine. So let's go ahead and do a Boolean difference here. And that's looking good. Let's select this cylinder here. I'm going to scale this up on the z-axis a little bit more. This needs to go all the way through to here, as you can see over here. And I think we also need to scale this down a little bit. And also, let's make sure this is centered. Let me try to snap it to one of these edges here. That's not working. I'm just going to eyeball this. So let's move it up to, or over to here. And I think that looks about right. I'm going to apply rotation and scale and do another Boolean difference here. And I think this is looking good. But what I forgot to do is add bevels to these corners here. So let's see, I'll select this cutter here and go into edit mode, and I'll just select these edges here, do Control B, and let's do something like this maybe. Okay, that's looking good, I think. Perfect, the bevels are working, shading is nice, so let's go ahead and apply our cutters here. And we can delete this object and this one. And the topology looks fine. I'll just make it a little more consistent by going in there and changing some of the connections. So I'll create a connection here in the corner and over here, and I'll do a connection over here and over here. This will just make it a little more consistent with the rest of the topology here. And let's see, it looks like we also need to clean this up a little bit. Let's just try and dissolve this edge here. It's not possible. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll just select this edge here and subdivide it, which will create an additional vertex here at the center. And then I can select these two verts here, hit the J key to create a connection, and I'll do the same thing over here. So subdivide this edge and select these two verts and create an edge here. And now we should actually be able to get rid of this edge and this edge here. And I don't think we need to clean up anything else. So everything looks fine here. Let's check the top. The connections here are okay. I'm not going to change anything here. Okay, so that looks perfect. Let's go ahead and mirror this over to the other side. And that's the next detail finished, and we can move on. And now we're going to create this part at the front. The detail at the front here is not too complicated, but there's a few things we have to bear in mind when we do this. Let me switch off wireframe and let's have a closer look at this. Now, for one thing, we need to make sure that the distance between the top edge and the edge of this circle here is big enough for the bevel modifier to work. And let's see what else. We're going to do a Boolean union. And one of the issues we'll be having is that the Boolean union will be flush with this edge here, which means that we're probably going to have quite a few problems, and there will be quite a bit of repair work involved. I'm going to try and avoid that by using a little trick. And you can also see that we have this extrusion here, which extends to the right of this detail here. We're going to add that after the fact. The rest of this is pretty straightforward, I think. So let's go ahead and do this. What I'll do first of all is make a loop selection here. And this is probably not going to select the entire loop. I'm going to use the QOL select contiguous edges add-on, which will make it easy for me to grab this loop. And what I'll do then is Shift D to duplicate it, right click to keep it in place, and then I'm going to split it off as a selection. So let's go ahead and select this and let's move it forward a bit. And let's go, well, we already are in object mode. So let's make sure that the object origin is centered on the geometry here. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to scale this up a little bit. Like so. Let's apply rotation and scale. And then in edge mode, I'm going to select everything and extrude it and then scale it up to about here. We need to possibly make changes a little bit later. Now you can see that some of the faces here are facing the wrong way, so I'll just grab everything and do a Shift N to recalculate the outside. That's looking good so far. Let me just check in the front view. We also need this piece on the side here, and that's fairly simple to do. Let's go ahead and let's see, let me check the reference object here. Oh, it's a bit difficult to see. Okay, this starts about here. Let's say, well, I think we need to start with this edge here. Let's extrude this and move it over, and I'm going to scale the edges down. And I think down here, I'm going to pick this edge and extrude it, move it up. Let's scale this down. And I'll move it to about here and move this one over to here. And I'm going to make a cut, hit the A key to make a straight cut like so. And then we're just going to select everything and do a merge by distance. And this will remove one vertex. And then we can select these edges here and hit the F key twice. Okay, so that's not working. Let's see what we can do here. Yeah, the geometry is not really connected, so I'll just move this vertex up a bit and make another cut here, like so, and then I'll just select these two verts and merge them, and let's get rid of this one, Control X, and now we should be able to select all of these and fill this area with an N-gon. Let's select everything here and hit the F key twice. Let's go to vertex mode. I'll just dissolve this vertex here, and that's looking good. Let's grab this vertex here. I'll do a bevel, and because this is exposed on the outside and it will be visible, I think I'll just add maybe 10 segments, and let's do something like this maybe. I'm going to mirror this over, and I'm also going to mirror this down if I can. For some reason that's not working. Okay, now it's working, and let me just check if everything is okay. It looks like it is. So that's going to be our cutter. We're going to add the hole a little bit later. For now, let's just worry about doing that Boolean operation and fixing up the geometry. So what I'll do here is I'll just select all of the faces, and I'm going to extrude them back. Let's get rid of the bevel modifier here. Let's select everything and recalculate the outside. And I'm also going to use auto smooth on this one. Let's do this for our model as well. And then I'm just going to move this back into the geometry of our main object here and make sure that it doesn't penetrate the back wall. So something like this should be fine. And then I'll do a Boolean union. Again, a brush Boolean union, and let's move this on top of the bevel modifier, and let's see if the bevels are working. And they're just about working for me, so I'm not going to change anything here. And that's looking good. So we have a little bit of distance here, which is perfect. That's exactly what I wanted, because we can easily fix the area without doing a lot of repair work compared to the situations where we make this flush with the main object. In that case, it's going to be a bit of work to clean that up. So I think that's looking fine. So I'm going to apply my cutter here and delete this object. And let's go to the top view. And I'll just select everything here at the front and move it back a bit. Maybe let's do something like this, and let's compare this with the reference. It's actually supposed to be a little bit deeper, something like this. Okay, so that looks good. Now let's fix this area here. And hopefully what we can do is just select this N-gon here and this one over here. And let's try and use the F key. So in my case, that fixes that area. We do have an issue here at the top, but I think, not sure why that is happening. Let's check the bottom. Everything seems to be fine here. Let me just check what the issue is up here. I'm actually not sure. We don't seem to have any vertices on the inside, so let's just select this edge and use the F key, and that closes that gap. Okay, that was easy to fix. Let's just grab everything and do a merge by distance. And now that we have clean topology here, what we can do is make a loop selection here that should select all of the polygons around this circle here, and I'm going to do a manifold extrude and snap it to here, and then I'll do a merge by distance, and let's go ahead and dissolve these edges here. So as you can see, if you do it like that, it's actually pretty easy to add that Boolean union here. And what we also need is this additional extrusion here on the inside. If you take a look at the reference image, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 of these rings. 2 of them are extruded forward a little bit. And we still need to create that ring on the inside. So what I'll do here is I'll loop select these faces here and then do an extrude along normals. And let's do something like this. I'm holding down the Alt key to get an even extrusion. And we can still make changes to that once we left click, but everything's fine. So that looks good. The only thing I need to change is I need to select these faces over here and delete them. And then we need to close those gaps. So let's see, I'll just grab these 2 edges and use the F key, and then use the F key on this edge twice and on this one. And let's go ahead and mirror this over, and there we go. Now this is our first ring. We need 3 more, so I'm going to do a loop cut here with 2 cuts, so we get 3 additional rings here. Left click, right click, and then what I'll do, this second one is a little bit bigger than the other one, so I'm going to scale this up holding down the shift key, and maybe let's scale this out a little bit. So something like this should be fine. We need to extrude that innermost ring and the third ring a little bit, so let's go ahead and do that. I want to make a loop selection, and in order to be able to do that, I'll just grab these faces here and delete them, and I'll mirror this over. And what this allows me to do is make a loop selection here at the front without affecting any of the other faces here. And let's grab this loop here, and I'm going to extrude this forward a little bit. Let's do something like this, and then I'm going to select this loop and just move that forward a little bit further. Let's see, something like this looks fine. Actually, it's not that deep. Let's move this back a bit to about here maybe. Actually, I'm going to move it forward just a little bit more, something like that. Okay, so that looks good. Let's close the gaps here. I'll just use the F key on this edge, and on this one And again, I'll use mirror to mirror this over, and let's tab into object mode and let's check if the bevels are working. And actually this is looking very nice. Let me just switch the overlays and check that. Everything's looking really good. All we need now is this hole here at the top. So let's see, I'll just move the cursor to the selected object here, and then I'm going to use another cylinder, and I'll do maybe 32 vertices. Let's get it down. Auto smooth it and rotate it around the x-axis 90 degrees. Let's go to the front view. Just move it into position up here and scale it down a bit more. Just want to get the general size of this object right. So okay, I think that looks good. Perfect. So let's move this over to here, and I think the position looks actually pretty good. I just scale it on the y-axis. And if you take a look at the front view, this hole goes through the object and also through the back wall here. And we need to add holes on the right and at the bottom as well. For this, I'm going to use a mirror modifier, and I'll pick this object as our mirror object, and let's do a mirror on the X and Z axes, like so. Let's select both of these objects. Let's do a Boolean difference. And everything's looking fine. I think I'll change the connections once I've applied the cutter, but everything else looks good. So I'm just going to apply that cutter, delete it, and let's go to the front view. And I'll make a connection from here to here with the J key. And just get rid of this edge by dissolving it, and down here it's actually fine. So I'll just mirror this over to the other side, and we're finished with this detail. So the only thing left to do now is this part at the back. We'll be doing this additional detail at the back pretty much in the same way we did the one at the front. Again, we need to pay attention to the size of the detail, because we need to make sure that the distance here at the top, for example, and also at the bottom is big enough for the bevel modifier to work. And like before, we need to make this flush with this detail here, which means I'm going to use the same trick I used before in order to avoid any extensive repair work. So let's go ahead and do that. I just tab into edit mode here, and I'm going to make a loop selection here. And like before, I can't select the entire loop, so I'm going to use the add-on QOL, select contiguous edges, to make sure I can select the entire loop quickly. I'm going to Shift D, duplicate it, right click to keep it in place, and P to split this off as a selection. Let's go back to object mode, select this, and I'll just move it back. Shift S, and let's move the origin to the geometry. Let's go back to a solid view here, and I'm going to scale this up a bit, like so. Apply rotation and scale. Let's get rid of the bevel modifier, and well, let's tab into edit mode, select all the edges and extrude them and scale them up to, let's see, maybe about here, maybe a little bit smaller. And I'm going to select all the faces and do a Shift N to recalculate the outside and fix the normals issue that we're having here. Now let's have a look. Okay, so these holes here seem to be a little bit bigger than these ones here. We'll just use another cylinder here to do those. Let's tab into object mode, and I'm just going to add a new cylinder and auto smooth it. Again, this has 32 vertices. I'm going to scale it down and rotate it 90 degrees around the x-axis. Let's move it into position here, scale it down a little bit more, move it back and adjust the size a little bit. So this needs to be about this big. Let's move this over. And let's see, we need to put one here. Let me apply rotation and scale here. I'll just make a duplicate and move this down. And it looks like at the bottom here, we kind of need to line this up with this hole here. So I'll do something like this for this hole here. And maybe, let's see, I'll hit the G key and hold down Control and snap it to the center of this edge. So we're going to put this one here. And I think I didn't make a duplicate for some reason. So let's try and do that now. Okay, that seems to be working now. And here at the top, we're going to put it maybe here. So I think that looks about right. We could put it over here. Depends on how you want to do this, really. I think it needs to go over here, though. Let me just check the segments that we have here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, that's perfect. Because we also need to make sure that we can create these cutouts here later. And these need to be the same size. So we have 2 cutouts at the top. And we have 8 segments here at the top. 4 on this side and 4 on the other side, so that will be working fine. And let's see, we have, how many do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4 on this side. Let me just check that. We have 17 faces here. Okay, so that's actually not, that's not quite perfect. Let's see, how many faces do we have here? Here we have 7. So I think what I'll do in order to make this a little more consistent, I'll just move that cylinder over to here, which means that we have 8 faces here, which means 16 if we mirror this over, and these are 3. Maybe we'll just do 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I'll just do 4 cutouts here. We don't need to do this exactly as it is on the reference. And let's check this area here. I'm also going to use 4 segments to create each of these cutouts. So here we have 16 faces. We'll do another 4 cutouts here. I think what I'll do right away, at least I'll try, is I'll turn these into N-gon. So let's create our sections here right away. And like I said, I'm using 4 segments for each of these. Same here at the top, 4 segments here and 4 here. Actually, we don't need to do this on the other side. We'll just mirror this over. And I'll do the same thing down here. 4, 4. Okay, let's mirror this over. So that's basically our layout for what we're going to do. And I guess we could also turn these into N-gons here. It'll just make things a little bit easier to see. So let's mirror this over. So that's going to be our cutter here. Oh, there we go. There is my duplicate. I don't need this anymore. Let's just move this one back for now. And I'll tab into face mode and select everything and extrude it back. Let's select all the faces, do a Shift N to recalculate the outside, and let's move everything forward again a little bit. And make sure that we don't penetrate the back wall. So I'll do something like this. That should be fine for the Boolean operation. And I'll auto smooth this. And that's looking good. Let's go ahead and select both of these objects here, do a Boolean union. and move the cutter above the bevel object like before. So the bevels are working. I'll keep it as it is. I could scale this up a little bit, but I'm not going to. So this looks fine to me. Let's go ahead and apply the cutter. Delete this object here, and in the top view I'm going to select all the vertices at the back and move those back a bit. Let's just compare this to the reference. I'm going to move these forward a little bit more, so something like this looks about right. Okay, perfect. Now let's see, we can fix some of the connections here. Let's do, I do want to keep these as perpendicular as possible. This will help with the bevel modifier, so maybe I'll just join these two and get rid of this edge here. And let's see down here, the connection is fine as long as the bevels are working, and they are. We don't need to make any changes here. Just mirror this over to the other side, and that's looking good. So let's go back to object mode, and I'll select these two cylinders here and do a Control J to combine them into a single object, and I'm going to scale them on the y-axis. Now these holes only penetrate the back wall, they don't go all the way to the front. So let's move those back a bit to about here. Okay, and I'll use a mirror modifier, and this will be our mirror object here. That's looking good. Let's select both of these objects and do a brush Boolean difference. Let's move the cutter to the top. So I'm going to apply that. Delete this object, and the last thing, well, actually not the last thing, we also need to fix the areas down here. So we'll do this the same way as we did before. Let's just select the N-gons here, and hopefully using the F key will work. In this case it doesn't, so let's undo that. What I'll do instead is I'll just delete these N-gons, and then select these two edges here, use the F key, and then select this edge and hold down F, and hopefully, yeah, that's not quite working. Let's see why not. Maybe we have geometry somewhere that shouldn't be there, and indeed that's how it is. I'll just go back a few steps. I think all we need to do here is merge these vertices together. So I'm going to select them and maybe do a merge at, I'll do a merge at last. And well, let's just mirror this over, Alt X, and let's see, do we have a similar issue down here? It doesn't look like it, so let's try selecting the N-gons here again. And use the F key, and it's still not working. I'll just do a merge by distance. That didn't do anything. So what I'll try is, like before, I'm going to delete the N-gons here and try to fill this with the F key, and hopefully that will work. Yeah. And it seems that does the trick. Okay, perfect. Now we can select the loop here and do a manifold extrude, snap it to the front here. Let's do a quick merge by distance and select this edge loop and dissolve it. Control X. And it looks like, yeah, I didn't consider the fact that I needed to fix this area down here, which means these holes are not centered in these areas here. You can leave it as it is. I'll just do a loop selection here. Let's see. So let's grab all of these faces here. And I'll just move them and eyeball things. So I'll move them to about here. Looks right. Maybe we could move these a little bit more, something like that. And I'll just do the same thing down here. So let's grab this loop of polygons. And use a G key and just move this over to about here. And then I'll just mirror this over to the other side. So that's looking good. Let's check. In object view, everything seems to be working. Now what we can do is create these cutouts here. So let's go ahead and select these faces here. We only need to do this on one side. And I'll do an inset. And let's extrude those faces back a bit to about here maybe. Let's just check the reference model. Yeah, looks about right. And we need to add some bevels in the corners. So let's go ahead and select the edges here in the corners. Unfortunately, we can't use ring selections. We just need to manually select those. Oh, and I made a mistake here. Let's go back a few steps. Because when I did the inset in these areas, I need to make sure that each of the N-gons is inset separately. So I'm going to use I and hit I again to do the inset like that. And then extrude everything back like so. And now let's select the edges here in the corners. And let's do a bevel here. And I'll do maybe not 10 segments. Maybe let's bring this down to something like 6. And I'll make the bevels about this big. And I think we could help the look of the curvature here just by spacing apart these edges a little more evenly. So I'm going to do that. That's again going to be a little bit of work. For now, I'll just select all the vertices, do a merge by distance just in case. We can get rid of many of the faces here. Well, we don't need all of those. So I'm also going to turn everything here into N-gons like so. So you get the general idea. I'll speed this up a little bit, but before I do, I'll show you one more thing. So I'm going to, like I said, space the edges here apart a little more evenly. This should help to make that curve look a little more smooth. And I'll do the same thing down here. Okay, I think it does help a little bit. So I'll do this for all of the cutouts and I'll speed up the video. And once I've made those final changes, we can wrap up the model and finish it. Okay, so I've cleaned everything up. There's a couple more things we need to do. Let's see. Let's just check this in object mode. We do have an issue here with the bevel. I wonder what that is. It's because we have this additional vertex here. So let's just check the model here. So we need to fix these areas as well in order to make the bevel work. I'll just weld these vertices here. And over here, I'll just weld everything to here. Okay, so now the bevels seem to be working. Everything's looking fine, so I'm going to mirror this over to the other side. And that's looking good. Everything's nice and clean. There's one more thing we could do in order to wrap this up. Here at the back of the front wall, we don't need all of these faces here, so what we could do is select these ones and this one, and we do need two connections here. Actually, I think I'm going to change the connection here as well and create basically one in the corner here by joining these two vertices. And let's see, which one am I going to keep? I think I'm going to keep this edge here because it's more perpendicular, and I'm just going to dissolve this one. Let's check the top here. Yeah, I mean, as long as the bevels are working, I'm not going to worry about it. It looks fine, so I'll just mirror this over to the other side. And like I said, we don't need all of the faces here, so we could select these ones and this one and use the F key to turn this into an N-gon. I'll do the same here. So let's grab these faces and this one, and again turn this into an N-gon. Let me just check if the bevels are working. They are. And we need to do the same thing down here, of course. So let's grab these faces, turn them into an N-gon, and these ones down here as well. And let's mirror this over to the other side. And there we go. So that's our finished model. I think this has turned out quite nicely. And that's it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this and you learned a few things. Take care, and I'll catch you in the next one.